Hey everyone, I'm Brian Katulis. I'm a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. I want to thank you all for joining our webinar on U.S.-Israel relations as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visits the United States. Now, we had originally had intended to hold this session after Netanyahu's visit. In fact, if those of you are paying attention, the first title of this was after Netanyahu's visit. But if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that a lot of things have happened in the last week. Life happens. President Biden got COVID. He then ended his re-election campaign. Bibi's schedule shifted to the right a bit. He's now meeting today President Biden and Vice President Harris separately. And I believe he's scheduled to see former President Donald Trump tomorrow in Florida. So we're here today with a really great panel to what I hope will offer a clinical analysis about U.S.-Israel relations, the main topic, at a time when obviously there are a lot of strong emotions, a lot of advocacy and activism because of a horrific war that's killed far too many people and gone on very long. But our goal is to offer a clinical analysis on policy. It's what MEI does in its mission to try to inform the U.S. debate about the Middle East, as well as to build ties between the United States and the broader region. Today, towards that mission, we issued a report that I co-authored with two brilliant colleagues, Ben Friedman and Sydney Taylor. That is my latest hoped-for clinical assessment of the Biden administration's approach. It's the third in a series that will continue and began last year. And I even give the administration some grades. You can take a look at it. Probably the most controversial and thing that generates the biggest debate. But we're here to talk about the U.S.-Israel relationship, not my report. The structure for our webinar is pretty simple, but it's tight. We've got 60 minutes. I'm going to introduce our panel in a second. We'll have a discussion for the first 30 of those minutes. And then if you in the audience have any questions you'd like the panelists or even me to answer, you could put them in the Q&A function, and we have a team here who's helping figure out what are the biggest questions, and we'll try to sort it into the conversation. But first, I want to say we're all really proud, everyone at MEI, to introduce this excellent panel of experts. We respect your expertise and your experience, and we're very lucky to have some of your time here. And I'm going to introduce the panel in the reverse order of who's speaking in the introductions. First, let me start with Aaron David Miller, who is at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he's a senior fellow. He's also a jolly good fellow and really insightful, has decades of experience working on policy as a policy practitioner, but offers a great deal of insight about how to understand what's going on in the region, on U.S. foreign policy and on the U.S.-Israel relationship. He has, hot off the presses, with a colleague of his, a piece in Foreign Policy this morning that just came out, entitled "What Netanyahu Got from His Speech in Congress." So we're going to talk, of course, about the speech yesterday, but much, much more. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us. Second is David Schenker, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. David, I've known for a couple of decades too, and respect his work. First noticed your work on what was going on in Palestine and the Palestinian Authority back in the 1990s when I was living and working out there as well. David served in several Republican administrations. Most recently, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs under Mike Pompeo and the Donald Trump administration. And for those of you who like podcasts, last summer, David and I had a conversation in what was a limited edition series called Taking the Edge Off the Middle East on the Middle East Institute podcast, where he offers great insights about his time in office, what's going on in the region, and how he got to where he was. And then last but not least is my friend Shira Efron, who is a senior fellow at the Israel Policy Forum. Shira and I have also known each other for more than a decade plus, and even worked together way back when at the Center for American Progress. She joins us from Israel, and we're honored to have you, Shira. And I'm going to start with you, Shira, on this topic of U.S.-Israel relations. And since you're in Israel and you have a deep analytic perspective as well as experience on this, Shira, how do you see U.S.-Israel relations today? What's your interim assessment, since we're still midstream in Netanyahu's visit to the United States? And in particular, what are the sort of policy outcomes that you expect to come from this visit?
Hello, everyone. Good evening from Israel. It is evening here, and it's an honor to be here with such great colleagues on this panel. You know, in terms of U.S.-Israeli ties, I think we're exactly where we were before the visit, right? In a sense, Israel has. I think it's safe to say that Israel wouldn't be able to survive this war, this multi-front war, and Israel is fighting now on 7 fronts, and I can count the fronts if you want, if it wasn't for the incredible support it received from the Biden-Harris administration. And this includes, weapons, right? Munitions that landed here, a jet full of munitions every day, plus the aircraft carriers, plus veto and other powers in the UN and so forth. I think that if we look at the speech and we compare the speech specifically to 2015, right, when Obama was president, I think Netanyahu behaved relatively in an attempt to be more bipartisan. There are a few, and we can talk about it, what he said about not mentioning, obviously, the Vice President Harris, even though he could have, speaking about slow munitions and other things. But I think in terms of where we, and I'll get to the policy in a second, because I think there is no policy outcome in the moment. From an Israeli perspective, and I think that's what, speaking from here, it's interesting. The speech here was the biggest game in town, right? We didn't have a State of the Union 2 hours later. So this was sort of the State of the Union, and the audience was Israeli, right? Netanyahu wanted to show to the Israelis that he's a statesman, unlike all of his contenders. And his competitors. He's a statesman. He broke a record being the foreign leader speaking to a joint session of Congress 4 times, more than Churchill, counting, everyone here counted standing ovations. This was the big thing. He has great English, better than 99% of Israelis. He knows how to perform. I don't want to be disrespectful, but he brought visual aids. He brought props. He brought, a Bedouin fighter and a war hero, and Noor Gamani, who was a hostage who survived in Hamas captivity and whose mother died. So he brought all these, and I think for Israelis, even those who don't like the prime minister, that was moving, right? That part. And also with Israel, to Israelis, the message that Israel's war is the West's war, right? It's a war between good and bad, and that Israel really is on the front lines protecting Europe and America against jihad. This resonates with Israelis. I think, and also, by the way, the insults of protesters, just using very blunt language, useful idiots. I think even if that's what you think, there are probably better ways to describe this and talk about, freedom of expression, and which is something we're supposed to value as a democracy. The biggest problem, I think, and this, if you judge on polling of most Israelis, that even though they're impressed with the speech, is the disconnect between this show of force and empty talk about total victory and what's actually happening in this country. So the first thing is that, hostages continue to die in Hamas captivity. As of now, they're, after rescuing more bodies yesterday, we're talking about around 115 hostages that we know are in Gaza, but the best estimates are that 55 of them are alive, and it could be less. Soldiers die every day. I'm not going to talk about the Palestinian side here. Obviously, it's a big thing, but in Israel, we don't talk about it. So we can talk about the humanitarian and the death toll in Gaza also, but this is not the focus of Israelis. Soldiers, there are 60,000 formal IDPs, internally displaced persons, right, in the north, but there are also 150,000 people who are under constant rocket fire every day. A person died in an apartment in Tel Aviv, the center of Tel Aviv, right by the U.S. embassy or the embassy branch, the consulate, in his bed as a result of a drone from Yemen. This is not Israel that we know and you all know, right? Everyone here on this panel know Israel very well. I was in Kiryat Shmona, which is the city in the north, on Sunday this week. It's empty. empty. I don't know if you remember these movies on Chernobyl after the nuclear disaster. This is how it looks. It's a city with no people. The economic situation is terrible. Forecasts are futile. And Netanyahu, of course, didn't accept responsibility for any of that in the speech. You know, the word accountability, funny enough, doesn't have a translation in Hebrew, but he didn't try to find a word for it. And so there was a lot of dissonance between the big talk and no policy solutions. Now, there's plenty that he could have done, right? There's a hostage deal, ceasefire agreement, depending how you call it, and that would help de-escalate everything. It will help de-escalate the north. It will help de-escalate all these other fronts. Maybe not solve everything, but at least de-escalate. He didn't acknowledge some possible future with the Palestinian state, not a Palestinian state at the moment, but a possible path which will help unlock a possible viable day after option for Gaza. And that regional alliance he did mention, but obviously not how we get there. And in terms of what's actually happening, you know, there are constantly mixed messages, right? Because he's saying, he said, I won't rest until they bring the hostages back home. But in practice, the Israeli delegation to Doha was supposed to leave Monday. It was postponed to today, supposedly after the speech. Then was postponed again to Sunday. Presumably to coordinate with President Biden, whom he's meeting. I believe Biden made it very clear where he is. So the delay is onshore. And you know, I still want to be hopeful and hope that this visit, this week-long visit during a war, okay, he left on Monday, he's going to come back on Sunday, so it's a 7-day visit, will come back with a result, an outcome. And maybe I'll just end that maybe some historical reference today, 30 years ago, July 25th, 1994, Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan signed the Washington Declaration, which ended the 46-year war between the two countries, right? And on July 26th, they gave the joint address to Congress. And so Netanyahu is a historian, he knows that, and I hope he uses this day to bring something to Israel, because otherwise it looks here like a trip abroad for Washington is beautiful. It's nice this time of year, or I don't know if it's nice this time of year. It's warm, but there's really no reason for him to be there if he doesn't come back. He doesn't come back with a policy path that gets us out of this miserable situation.
Great, thanks, Shira. So to summarize, you don't see yet any policy outcomes, but you remain hopeful that he hopes to produce something in the next few days, given that he spent a week here. But it was mostly about messaging to the Israeli public and this message that Israel's war is the West's war. Thanks for that, and I'll come back to you on some points that you raised. I want to turn next to David. David, during your last stint in public service, which I mentioned when you were the head of the Middle East Department at the State Department, the Middle East Bureau, you were responsible for U.S. diplomacy across the whole region. And now you're an analyst back at a think tank. How do you assess both what's happened so far on this visit, where things are in U.S.-Israel relations? Are there outcomes on not just the ceasefire and hostage release deal, but the ideas that Netanyahu talked about in terms of a regional security alliance, and also the questions of Iran? That's a lot there, but how do you situate sort of U.S.-Israel relations today in this visit in that broader regional context?
Well, thanks, Brian. First of all, thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. It's great to be here today with Shira and David. Aaron, I know, I think my mom's out there watching because I told her that Aaron was going to be on. So she's a big fan. Listen, there's a lot to talk about for 6 minutes, but let me start with Netanyahu's speech just briefly. Notwithstanding the protests and some prominent no-shows in the chamber, I think the premier's address at the joint session of Congress probably exceeded expectations. It was relatively nonpartisan, save for the remarks about the protesters that Shira mentioned. It gave some, I think, tactful shout outs to President Biden and Trump, and focused on the importance and strength of the bilateral relationship and our common challenges. Our enemies are your enemies, he said. Netanyahu spoke a lot about Hamas, but he didn't say a lot about Israel's vision for Gaza going forward. Demilitarized and de-radicalized, I think, was the only thing he said. That was the extent of his comments. He didn't mention a role for the Palestinian Authority in post-war Gaza, but neither did he exclude the possibility, as he had previously articulated. I anticipate the issue of post-war Gaza is going to be a main topic of the Netanyahu's discussions with President Biden and Vice President Harris. On the topic of Iran's proxies, the issue of broadening the war, Netanyahu discussed the Israeli strike on Hodeidah port, and he pledged that Israel would continue to respond to Houthi provocations, extracting a cost for the attacks. As for Hezbollah, the prime minister basically confirmed Israel's longstanding position that we, quote unquote, prefer a diplomatic solution, but that Israel would do what was necessary to return its internally displaced population to the north. Finally, he placed the entire war in the context of Iran's war of attrition, both against Israel and the United States. Frankly, I don't think there are any surprises there. In terms of the visit's impact on the region going forward, I don't think it will be significant. If the meetings with Biden, Harris, and Trump have good optics, it may stem, at least in part, if not dispel, the growing regional perspective that U.S.-Israel relations are deteriorating, perhaps beyond repair. This, as Netanyahu pointed out, is important. Israel is facing increasing international diplomatic isolation. The perception that U.S.-Israel relations are at a difficult point, I think, further emboldens bad actors in the region. But the visit won't fundamentally change the dynamics on the ground. The prime minister now appears committed to getting a ceasefire. My guess is that it will happen in the coming weeks, perhaps after the Knesset goes on recess, a development that will insulate Netanyahu from a vote of no confidence or other challenges from his coalition partners. My guess is that the Palestinian Authority meeting with Hamas and China this past week, which supposedly resulted in agreement of national unity, is a lot less than advertised. But I think it's going to be really messy on the ground in Gaza, even if there is a ceasefire. Even if the United Arab Emirates and other Arab partners agree to deploy to Gaza, it's going to be tough for Washington to start orchestrating a new post-war regime from the outside. But the bigger question for me right now really relates to Hezbollah. I believe Israel has come to the conclusion that it's a matter of when, but not if, there will be a war between Israel and Hezbollah. But after 9 months of fighting in Gaza, Israel wants a break for the troops and time to rearm. Israel, Hezbollah, and Hezbollah's Iranian masters don't want right now what would be an incredibly destructive war. If there is a ceasefire in Gaza, Hezbollah may wind down its campaign against Israel, but frankly, that won't be enough for Israel. Israel cannot live with the status quo of October 6th on its northern border. But will Hezbollah agree to deploy or redeploy its Radwan forces 7 kilometers north of the border, of something along the Litani? That's the deal, basically, that Biden administration envoy Amos Hochstein is working on right now. I can talk more. I think I have a minute here, but let me just lay out the agreement that's in play, which is for Hezbollah to remove its forces 7 kilometers north, roughly the length of an anti-tank weapon, to the Litani, and for the Lebanese armed forces, roughly 6,000 of them, to deploy to the border. The UN's interim force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, would be augmented perhaps with some German troops who would more reliably call balls and strikes when Hezbollah violates the agreement. The blue line, the border between Israel and Lebanon, would be modified, likely and delineated in Lebanon's favor, including reuniting the divided town of Rajar, and Israel would agree to curtail its flights over Lebanon. This is a lot of moving parts. It's a long shot, but it might succeed and defer a war in the north that would enable Israeli citizens to return to their homes, at least temporarily. If an agreement isn't reached, I think we're headed toward a very serious escalation. But regardless of what happens with Hezbollah, regrettably, I think the operational tempo of the Houthis is going to increase. Israel's operation against Hudaydah, the strike, was impressive, but the Houthis are undeterred. This will compel the Israelis, I think, going forward to do even more. The Wall Street Journal, many of you saw the piece last week, talking about how CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command responsible for the Middle East, was concerned that U.S. action in the Red Sea was failing to curtail the Houthis, and that U.S. servicemen and women were increasingly at risk. The administration approach is, I think we can all agree, insufficiently robust to either ensure freedom of navigation or prevent the type of operations that the Houthis are conducting. However, I think it's unlikely that this lame duck Biden administration will do more prior to elections. Regrettably, the same goes for Iran. This incredibly thorny problem will be left over for the Harris or Trump administration to deal with. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Great. That was great, David. And thanks for widening the aperture to include Iran, Houthis a bit, and then Hezbollah. I do want to circle back after Aaron has said a few words about how you see U.S. and Israel and whether they're aligned on those fronts or whether there's any gaps. And I should note, I'm glad you also mentioned Hezbollah, because I don't know if our audience knows this, but Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has now mentioned David Schenker, I think at least 3 times in some of his videos, if I'm not mistaken, which is a sign of impact, that you've gotten into the leader of Hezbollah's head, so much so. So thanks for your comments. Let me turn to Aaron. Aaron, out of all of us here, you've got the most experience, long experience, and you know what that means, both inside of government and then outside. And I mentioned this piece that you published this morning in Foreign Policy, which I think is brilliant in the fact that you actually blend not just the policy, but then importantly, the politics of where things are in Israel and also the United States. And it's really, again, I recommend it to everybody who's watching the webinar here. Situate yourself in the context of U.S.-Israel relations right now and the years that you've spent on all of that as a negotiator, as a key interlocutor. What's your snapshot on these big picture strategy questions Shira and David have talked about so far?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you, Brian, David, and Shira. There are no finer analysts of the region and Israel than the 3 of you. It's a very broad question. Let me begin with a sort of heretical construct. I would define a U.S. ally in 3 ways outside of treaty obligations. A U.S. ally is a country with which there is a high degree of coincidence of values, 1. A high degree of coincidence of interests, 2. No 2 countries have a strict coincidence. And finally, a U.S. ally is a country that has demonstrated a sustainable basis of domestic support, right? Canada, New Zealand, Japan, France, Germany, Australia, outside of treaty obligations. Saudi Arabia is not an ally of the United States. There is no coincidence of values, not as most humans would describe them. I would argue there's an episodic coincidence of interests, although Saudi Arabia has their important equities in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And finally, there's almost no sustainable basis of domestic support. Israel, for decades, has been perceived as an ally because it encompasses those 3 pockets, those 3 elements. And I would argue, as I watched the U.S.-Israel relationship through decades, ups and downs, Republicans and Democrats, Likud, Labor, the Sharon government, that I don't think I remember a time where all 3 of those foundational elements of the U.S.-Israeli very special and unique relationship are more fraught or under greater stress. There are many reasons for that, but driving in my judgment, the main reason is that if a healthy U.S.-Israeli relationship involves reciprocity, trust and confidence, and a mutual respect for one another's interests, what's happened to the U.S.-Israeli relationship in recent decades is that the bipartisan support, which has defined that relationship, and under the best of circumstances, has created, I think, a healthy relationship. I mean, we can talk endlessly about the value, the idea, the necessity of U.S. support for Israel. But that bipartisanship is coming apart. And the point we make in the piece this morning is that the Netanyahu visit and the speech, the significance is not what Netanyahu will achieve here, but what the Netanyahu visit reflects. And I think it reflects a polarization on in American politics that is really so acute. The Republican Party, and again, I would say I worked for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats, although the Republicans were of a different kind of Republican. The Republican Party has emerged as more or less as the Israel can do no wrong party. The Democrats are deeply divided, not just between progressives and mainstream Democrats, but mainstream Democrats. You have the three Chris's, Coons, Van Hollen, and Murphy, all in the last several months doing something that would have been almost unthinkable 2 or 3 years ago, which would be calling for a conditioning or restriction of U.S. military assistance in some fashion in an effort to impose a cost or consequence on policies, tactics they did not like. So the Democratic Party is literally debating what does it mean to be pro-Israel? What is the definition of being pro-Israel? And I guess as someone who believes that there is value in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, despite the tensions and the contradictions and the hypocrisies and anomalies of that relationship, which continue to characterize it, I think that's a very worrying sort of tendency. Mr. Netanyahu has almost single-handedly contributed to the fracturing, but American politics also has played a major role. Just one last point on this. I have a term called the cosmic oive with respect to the U.S.-Israel relationship. I believe there will be a change in Israel's political leadership. I think that is essential, not just for the U.S.-Israel relationship, but for any prospect of Israeli-Palestinian, a better pathway for Israelis and Palestinians. I'm not entirely persuaded how transformational that political change will be. I think the next Israeli prime minister, and Shira would hope could weigh in on this, will be a he or she that believes deeply in an independent judiciary that will induce more civility and comedy in the political dialogue in Israel, but will be very withholding and extremely risk averse when it comes to how to deal with what I see as the major problem Israel has, which is for Palestinians as well. And I'll deploy river to the sea here in an educational context. The basic problem is, what do you do with 15 million humans who are living between the sea and the river? That, to me, is the central strategic question that needs to be faced up to by Israelis, Israeli Arabs, Palestinians under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, what to do about Palestinians in Gaza and East Jerusalem. So I don't know if that helps any. I don't want to drone on for much longer, but I want to take a step back rather than get caught up in the headlines, maybe look at some trend lines.
Great. That's perfect, Aaron. And we've hit that 30-minute mark where I'm going to start asking you some questions and blending in questions that we've received from the audience. And I want to start almost sort of where you left off. You mentioned the Palestinians. Shira, in your introductory remarks, you said there in Israel, we don't talk about the Palestinians. And though our seminar obviously is titled U.S.-Israel Relations, we can't help but put them on the agenda and talk about what's next. And Shira, I know you've done a lot of work, and including a piece recently I saw that you wrote with, I believe, Michael Koplow, your colleague, on the Palestinian Authority as well. And I think the central question I want to ask all three of you, though I think we can hear what Netanyahu said about the Palestinians, and David articulated that, he didn't mention the Palestinian Authority. What do you think when it comes to U.S. policy right now could be done to elevate the Palestinians in this discussion about the U.S.-Israel relationship? What's not being done right now? And I want to start with you, Shira, and then maybe just go down the line again. Aaron, I know in your previous positions in government, you had a lot of face time with Yasser Arafat and other previous leaders of the Palestinians, but want us to carry that forward to 2024, 2025. In this context of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the gaps that exist right now between the Biden team and Netanyahu government right now. But how do we actually address this from a policy standpoint, not just the politics as well? Shira?
Wow, so this is a very, very big question.
Yes.
Maybe I'll just have like top line thoughts, and because we're saying the U.S. here and not talking about the Israeli perspective, which frankly makes it easier for me. But I think in terms of, and I'm talking about the Biden administration, although it does seem from his statement so far that Trump would like to see this war end also, right? So, and I do want to remind everyone that even though maybe it looked quite differently, but Trump also spoke about a two-state solution and a Palestinian state. So it had a different, maybe the maps look certainly differently, but it wasn't the basic principle of an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, whether we like it or not, as the legitimate, internationally legitimate, not domestically legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, is something that, and David Schenker, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this was the same paradigm that we're in. I think there were, I guess I'll connect this to Gaza and then maybe try to bring it a little bit to the West Bank. What we have here, we have a humanitarian situation in Gaza that continues to be horrendous. That's what I referred to when I spoke about death toll in terms of the Israeli perspective. We don't speak about it. I understand it because of domestic political issues in the U.S. It's less in the headlines, but there is polio now in Gaza. So it's the worst day of, right, Yemen and other places we spoke about. Since the Rafah part of the operation of Israel, trucks have not been going in through Egypt. So it's all, and I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but clearly there's a terrible situation in Gaza itself. And I think the Biden administration has been fixated on, or not fixated, but the international community at large has been talking about a humanitarian situation. And at the same time, they kept talking about a two-state solution. They haven't done anything to connect the dots. And to me, the very quick wins could have been bringing the PA in different permutations, in different ways, and I have a variety of ideas, to different things the United States has been doing. JLOT, that pier that was not an example of U.S. power projection, let's say, most successful operation. But, at that point, the U.S. could have said, we are coming with Palestinian customs officers. Israel, you want to clear an area? You want to try this humanitarian bubble? We are doing rubble removal, and guess what? We're bringing the Palestinian civil defense, with whom you work with Israelis very closely, and they're unarmed. There are other ways to do this, and I think this, first of all, it would have put the onus on the PA, who I must say have been very vocal but very passive. They haven't done anything for their people in Gaza. So it would put the onus on them. We would test their capacity to actually do something, but I think it would have illustrated to the Israeli government that the sky doesn't fall when you involve the PA, which is what everyone here is so scared of saying. It's true that Netanyahu didn't say PA. He didn't say also no PA, which is what he's saying in Israel. And I do want to remind you that a few days before he traveled, the Knesset passed, it was legislation, but a decision against the Palestinian state ever, right? Netanyahu didn't vote for it, but Benny Gantz did, which is apropos what Aaron said about future government being more careful about these issues. But I think this is one thing that is not too late in doing. When we talk about the Rafah crossing, the Philadelphia corridor, which is one of the stumbling blocks for a hostage deal, this is where I think the PA can be brought in a way that would show a Gaza West Bank connection. I will also say there are a lot of goods coming from the West Bank to Gaza, which was an Israeli veto until now, and the U.S. can highlight that and say, look, Israelis, you're doing this West Bank Gaza connection. Let's have a leverage that is more diplomatic. I think on the RPA, Revitalized Palestinian Authority, you throw out like those terms and you don't define them. There's a lot to do in terms of what the U.S. wants. They pushed for a setup of a new government. They're not helping this government. They're not setting it up for success. I have my criticisms about this government, but once the U.S. encouraged it and approved it, I think they can do so much more to set it up for success, which we're not doing. And using their leverage, the U.S. needs to use its leverage for the reforms that are needed, not for Israel. They're needed for the Palestinian leadership to be a better government for their own people, right? Delivering services. And this is a lot of it in the Foreign Affairs article that you mentioned are on that also. And I think, and finally, I will also maybe end with this. I think there's a tendency in the international community, it's the US also, that like we go into panic and we're saying, oh, wait, Netanyahu, you have Smotrich in your government and he's using all his like powers to stall payments, right? And then we will come and save you and we'll agree to this deal that we're actually the sanctions that we put, we will lift them and we will agree to territorial compromises. For Smotrich is like the gift that keeps on giving and basically saving the Israelis from the political chaos here. And I think this is where the US should come to Israel and say, listen, guys, this is your own problem. It's a political problem. The Israeli cabinet passed a decision, this cabinet, July 2023, that they will work not to topple the PA. And you figured out how you're doing this because it's in your interest. So we're not coming to save you. We will help you, but talking in Israeli terms and not constantly basically saving Israel from the decision it needs to make, which, by the way, are in Israel's decision, and the defense establishment is right there. But we have
there's divisions. There's divisions in that defense establishment. So thanks for that, Shira. And I'm actually going to try to move more efficiently rather than ask you all to answer the Palestinian question or other things, because we do have a time constraint. And David, I'm going to come to you after I ask Aaron something that came in. And I think, given your article and your perspective, a question we have from Ellen Nickmeyer from AP. And if any of you else want to jump in, that's fine. What are the motives driving the meeting between Netanyahu and former President Trump tomorrow, which comes for Trump after 3 years of critical statements of Netanyahu? And then how do you also assess, I don't know if you all saw Trump's note to Mahmoud Abbas, that everything will be good?
Let's start with that, because I think the sugar high that President Trump created on the issue of Israel, Palestine, largely almost exclusively for the Israelis, between 2016 and 2020, there's no guarantee, given Trump's unpredictability and the realities, that he doesn't want to be bothered in the main with distractions on his watch, including an unresolved Israeli-Hamas war in Gaza. That same approach is going to be taken, assuming Mr. Netanyahu, and maybe you'll have an election in Israel in 2025, probably not before. I think that Trump's conception of the American national interest is tethered essentially to his own political interests and his own needs and requirements. I think his main emphasis will be domestic. I think it won't be transaction at all. It'll be transformational for many reasons, and we're going to have another discussion about that. But I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu has staked much of his political career in the last 2 decades in tethering himself to the Republican Party can count on pure and unadulterated support from the Trump administration. And he may well, let's assume just for the sake of argument that Mr. Trump wants to do what he and Mr. Kushner began in the first administration, investing in an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal. And let's assume Mr. Netanyahu is still prime minister. And let's assume that the ante up in that deal is something on the Palestinians. Trump would have no compunction whatsoever in pressing Netanyahu to give more, and actually, who knows, might be in a better position than the Biden administration to actually get something more, however symbolic it might be, from Netanyahu. So I think Benjamin Netanyahu's time frame is the next 6 months. Right now, it means mending ties with an irascible, angry president who believed that he did send a video message congratulating President Biden and didn't side with Trump's claims that the election was stolen. So it's a sort of a forgiveness or apology tour, which is very important to Netanyahu as he calculates the next 6 months.
Great. David, I want to pick up on this notion of the Israel-Saudi deal. And Aaron also had said some things in his opening remarks about Saudi Arabia. In essence, Trump outlined his vision for a post-war Gaza and talked about the potential for support from countries in the region for that mission. What's your assessment of that, given that you travel to the region quite a lot, talk to leaders all around the Arab world? It's part of your work. Did Trump have a clear enough vision? Do you think it's something that you can get the support for, especially given that the Knesset just last week rejected in a pretty strong vote to rejected a Palestinian state? So what's your assessment of those plans, either in the last 6 months of the Biden administration, or as Aaron was just talking about, if it's a Trump-Vance administration in 2025? What do you see pathways there for a deal, and what does the Palestinian component look like, David?
Yeah, thanks. Listen, I think that the time is just too short for this administration to seal this deal. I think they worked out the details on the nuclear element for enrichment for the Saudis. I think that they have worked out the defense, what a defense pact of some sort looks like. But the missing link here is really what type of progress or what type of commitment Israel makes on the Palestinian front. And in that regard, it has to be, just because of regional dynamics, competition or rivalry between Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, there's got to be something more that the Saudis can get than what the Emiratis got for their normalization in the Abraham Accords during the Trump administration. And this Israeli government, for this administration, will not do that. I think this administration tried to present Netanyahu with the Faustian choice here. You know, you take normalization and maybe you lose your government, or, you know, your government falls, or you give something on the Palestinians. And I don't think he was willing to make that choice, and they've run out of time. And I think the lame duck period now just doesn't afford it, even though, you know, Congress at one point may have been amenable for it. No doubt, however, this will be a top agenda item for Trump. And I think, you know, Aaron's right. I think the administration will make a big ask. At the end of the day, you know, personnel is policy. I'm not sure the president himself, you know, has detailed views of what that should be. But I would anticipate people like David Friedman and others will, you know, if there's a Trump 2, that they will be coming back and advising the president. But above all else, you know, notwithstanding some of the rhetoric that we've heard, I think above all else, the president's going to want an end to all regional wars. He says he's going to end the Ukraine-Russia war in a day. I think this is going to be a priority and the de-escalation in the region. Yes, we killed Soleimani, but we also, after Fujira scuttled boats in the Gulf, Abqaiq being hit by the Iranians, a number of other provocations, a drone being shot down over the Persian Gulf and international airspace by the Iranians. We didn't respond directly against Iran. I think this is a president who, has been, relatively cautious, willing to break China at times, but overall relatively cautious. But I think there will be an ask of the government of Israel.
Great. So let me just stay with you, David, and on a different topic, and then Shira, maybe you could also offer your thoughts on the same topic. We've had some questions about the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, what's been ongoing, and you said a few things in your opening remarks about this, David, and I know you know this very well. You've worked on it inside and outside of government. My main question to the topic of this panel is U.S.-Israel relations. How aligned do you see both governments right now, Israel and the United States, on this challenge of Hezbollah and the threat that it continues to pose on a near daily basis? There's more than, I guess, 60,000 Israelis who are still displaced from the conflict there. Do you see there's different voices inside the Israeli government about Amos Hochstein's mission that you mentioned? How do you see sort of the U.S. and Israel coordinating on this? Because it does seem to be like a huge flashpoint if it erupts even further.
Yeah. This administration does not want a broadening of the war, does not want another war in the region in the next 6 months before elections. When President Biden was still in the race, this would have been maybe the first time ever that Israel was a factor in U.S. presidential elections, right? Having an impact one way or the other. And I don't think that's a good look for Israel, something that Israel doesn't want. So certainly people that support the ongoing strong relationship between Israel and the United States don't want that to happen. I think there's an appreciation in this administration, however, that the status quo on the border, that is having 10,000 Radwan troops on Israel's border in these so-called Green Without Borders, environmental NGO military bases of Hezbollah, armed to the teeth, ready to perpetrate an October 7th, because in fact, what Hamas did was Hezbollah's war plan, is unacceptable, and that Israel cannot live and tolerate any longer that situation on the border. When Amos Hochstein, the U.S. envoy, is trying to negotiate this deal, was last in Lebanon, he told the government of Lebanon, and it was said very publicly, that we don't want a war. However, if there is a war, that the United States will back Israel. It's not clear whether that was a rhetorical position to increase the leverage on Hezbollah to come to some sort of accommodation. I have no doubt that the United States would support Israel. But it's really, I think the United States is really reluctant to get into this. For all the damage that was done, both diplomatically, regionally, the humanitarian tragedy, the suffering of Palestinians and Israelis resulting from October 7th, what will happen in the Israel-Hezbollah war will be exponentially more damaging, not only to Lebanon and Hezbollah, right, innocent Lebanese, but also to Israelis, the IDF.
Yeah. So again, turning to Shira, and maybe talk a bit about this, but your views on how Israel's defense and security establishment have been managing not just this Hezbollah theater, but the wider regional dynamics. And then when I turn to you, Aaron, I want you to give some thought also about the Iran, which was mentioned, of course, by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But when I get to you after Shira, how you see sort of U.S. strategy, as it were, on Iran and what Israel's approach is as well. But Shira, I know you not only focus on a lot of things in your work, but also have done reserve duty. What's the discussion inside of the Israeli security establishment about the threats posed by Iran and some of its partners, including Hezbollah and the Houthis?
So obviously the major threat, sort of the immediate threat that everyone's talking about, are those 7 fronts that Israel's fighting in, right? We're talking about, Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen and Iraq and Iran itself. And there are fears of additional fronts. There's a fear that Iran recognized Jordan as a weak link, and they're trying to infiltrate the Jordanian system, and through there to also undermine the West Bank, which is really teetering on the brink. We're already losing parts of the West Bank with no governance of the PA at all, right? Tulkarm and Nablus, all this. So this is sort of concerning. There's also a deeper concern about, but not an immediate one, about the fact that Iran has become de facto a threshold nuclear state, right? And this is something that Netanyahu didn't mention yesterday. He just mentioned sort of like this ring of fire around Israel. The assessment, and this is, I was in the MOD earlier this week, so it's sort of most up to date. I'm not talking about Northern Command where, tactically we see constant tit for tat with Hezbollah, right, and assassination and all that. But I'm thinking from the strategic perspective, the underlying assumption is if we reach a temporary ceasefire agreement, I'm not even talking about a longer one, right? A temporary ceasefire agreement, which will be part of the hostage deal, if one is achieved, that will calm everything down, because Nasrallah did link his fight with Israel, this conflict, linked to Gaza, and so did the Houthis. The Houthis say, we will continue to strike Israel as long as Gaza is under fire. I completely agree with David that probably a war with Hezbollah is only a question of time, right? It's when more than an if. But not now. The Israeli security establishment, by the way, Netanyahu himself does not want a war in the north at the moment. And the hope is that if we get to a ceasefire agreement, even if Israel resumes fighting, right? Because if Netanyahu goes to a ceasefire agreement with his political considerations, he has to promise his coalition partners that the war is not over. He's going for total victory, whatever it is, that Hezbollah will use this as the off-ramp to de-escalate. The plan B in Israel, which I'm not sure is going to work, but the plan B is that as Israel is moving to the 3rd stage of the war in Gaza, which will be more like raids and less of the heavy fighting, that this would also help that it would move Hezbollah to take the off-ramp and de-escalate also. But David Schenker also said, with the Houthis, was this going to fly? I'm not sure. I got to say the discussion in Israel about a war with the North is, as David said, it's going to take the country decades backward. People are talking here about days without electricity, weeks without electricity. This is not a war that Israelis want to have, not now. And even the prime minister himself doesn't want to have it. So I'm hoping that we find a way to de-escalate and not get there at the moment. Great,
thanks, Shira. Aaron, I was going to ask you that question about Iran, but we've only got like 3 or 4 minutes left. And while we've been on this seminar, I just heard the sad news that Martin Indyk passed away today.
And I saw that too.
And I actually think I'm going to call an audible here, and if you don't feel like it, but I knew you know him well. A lot of us knew him very well through the community. I wonder if you just wanted all of you to say something about any reflection on him, and if not, take a pass on it. I am sad to hear this news. He's such an important part of the Middle East policy community. Aaron?
I worked for a long time with this small group of people through several administrations on this issue. We succeeded at times, but by and large, we did not. I spent the last 20 plus years in the public conversation trying to figure out, take a look in the mirror and deal honestly as to why we didn't succeed. What was our responsibility in this? But I have to say, one of the extraordinary things about Martin was the degree to which Martin's thinking about a whole complex of problems, particularly the U.S.-Israeli relationship and Israel's relations with its Arab neighbors, really did evolve. And it required a degree of courage and clarity from Martin. I think that was hard for him. And we had our differences, but I'm going to miss him. And I will say that many will say, may his memory be a blessing.
Thanks, Aaron. David or Shira, just on this point, I'm sorry to close on a sad note, but because Martin, as Aaron articulated, I mean, he served in many positions. He was the U.S. ambassador to Israel. I first came across him when I was a junior intern at the National Security Council with Bruce Riedel in the second Clinton administration. And he was always very kind and thoughtful. But the important thing in most recent years, his views were textured, smart, and they evolved. They changed. It's something we in the think tank community, I think, should aspire to. And he was always looking for more inputs. David or Shira, I don't know if you want to say anything. If not,
I like to just say one or two things. You know, he's the founding executive director of the Washington Institute. I think the guy was, you know, before his time, had an enormous impact on the field and what we do, and on the over the years, over the crafting of policy and the debate. Just personally, after I found out I was going to be assistant secretary or was announced, I sought him out for advice on how you do this job. And he was very generous to me with his time and input, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Shira?
Sure. So I've known Martin, like all of you, maybe less years, but he's also a board member of Israel Policy Forum. But, you know, to me, he was always a mentor, and he was really proud of being a mentor to younger people, always encouraging. I agree with you, Brian. I mean, and even in his last years being sick, he was always the most creative thinker and open-minded and looking at things with nuance, and of course not mincing words and criticisms, but always such a creative mind. And I guess in the last conversation I had with him, which was not that long ago, I guess it was in a board call, but he did say something about don't be discouraged. And I think that one day Israelis and Palestinians will find a way to live in peace. And it's not going to happen in my lifetime, referring to his lifetime, but it will happen. So, you know, inshallah. It's a true loss to the U.S., to Israel's supporters, and to everyone else.
Yeah, so I'm sorry to the audience for closing on a somber note, but I thought appropriate because I literally heard about it when we were about to close the conversation here. And what I'd say first on substance and what we were talking about, U.S.-Israel relations. Clearly, as Aaron said at the outset, it's stressed. It's under enormous strain. And it's because of the political issues that we all have talked about, but also because of the complex policy questions and strategy questions both the United States and Israel faces. I think no one on this panel had high expectations of major outcomes from Bibi's visit here, from Netanyahu's visit to the United States, and that there's going to be, no matter what, who's elected in the United States in November, whether it's Harris or Trump, a long list of tough policy questions to deal with. And that in this period of political uncertainty in the United States and Israel, it's important to have these sort of conversations that, yes, we could make them more inclusive. Yes, we should include more voices and talk about different topics. And I hope we continue to do so. But I just wanted to close in the spirit of, I think, all of us who knew Martin Indyk with a warm thank you for your expertise and for sharing your views from many different angles. I learned a lot. This webinar, for those of you who weren't able to join the first half, will be posted on the MEI website. And I appreciate all of you for spending time with all of us. So thanks again, Aaron, David, and Shira, and we'll talk to you soon.